seats. Is this on? Yes? Yeah, it's on, huh? Okay. Yeah. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Reinhold Martin, the director of the Temple Hoyne Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture, which you might have noticed is at least nominally the host institution for this other institution, since we're talking about the 8th season. Yeah, I did, okay. Now, is that on? Should be. Is that better? Okay, sorry. So the Buell Center has been hosting this institution for going on 8 years now. Yeah, that's right. And I think it will become self-explanatory what you're in for. So I'm not going to, delay that any further. Only to add just a quick couple of notes from the Buell Center, since there's some things I'll take the opportunity, since I have a captive audience, to let you know about a couple of things going on besides this that we've been working on this summer that will appear on your screens in the fall. One is an exhibition that will open on September 12th, a date you might recognize, called Public Matters. It's about New York, architecture in New York after 9/11. It's not about Ground Zero, it's about what happened in New York after Ground Zero and the various projects, kind of behind the scenes look at at architecture as a matter of public contestation in this city in the last 10 years. And that will come up in the gallery, in the cafe over here, and there will be a sort of party slash roundtable discussion on September 12th when the show opens. Another event to look forward to is happening on September 17th at PS1 at MoMA. We're collaborating with our colleagues at the Museum of Modern Art on an exhibition and workshop exhibition titled Foreclosed. The subtitle's Rehousing the American Dream. I hope that's relatively explanatory. There's going to be open studios. There are 5 teams of architects working on a series of suburban sites and housing and suburban sites around the country, who will be presenting their work in a kind of open studio fashion on the 17th, September 17th at MoMA. So you're all invited to come, and it's lots of fun. You can go walk around the PS1 studios, and after that there'll be a formal event with some fairly recognizable figures. I officially invite you to that. But in the meantime, here we are with other more than recognizable figures. I don't need to, therefore, introduce them to you, other than saying that on my far left is the Charles Gwathmey Professor in Practice at Yale University, Peter Eisenman, and on his and on his right is the Dean of the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia, Mark Wigley. And the rules of the game here are essentially that there is a theme, or a sort of nominal theme. In this case, the name of the game is Project versus Practice, or Project and Practice. And to get the discussion going, Peter is going to make a sort of summary or a sort of statement or a series of provocations to which no doubt Mark will have a series of thoughts of his own, and it will, as you'll see, kind of go from there. There'll be about, I'd say, 45 minutes or so of discussion amongst our protagonists, and then will give you time to prepare your questions, because the sparks perhaps can start flying even higher if you raise some questions of your own. So I will, without further intervention, I'll just deliver the floor to my colleagues and welcome them again to round 8 of Eisenman Wigley. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Reinhold. I'm not certain whether this is a 10-rounder, 12-rounder, or 15-rounder. Mark Wigley assured me that it was going to be a 10-rounder, but I ain't so sure anymore.
Sounds like a 15-rounder.
It sounds like a 15-rounder, so it's a heavyweight title fight. What you realize when the numbers start to build up and there's clearly something going to happen at the end, that you better be more serious and be less foolish than one normally is on these occasions in the summer. So I actually prepared a sort of beginning to get into the subject, and Mark has said that it's all right if I speak for 7 or 8 minutes as a beginning to this. Last year, we talked about, the theme was Genius Loci versus Zeitgeist. And basically, I would argue that both of those ideas represent alternative projects. And so I thought, well, what then defines a project? And I thought that would be a very useful beginning, since the last year's talk were, in a sense, subsets of a larger issue, project versus practice, or project or practice. And today I would like to define historically what I would say is a project. And I'm going to describe quickly six projects. Each of the projects contains a critical moment that is critical of the project that went before, and you will see this develop. The first project, I would argue, was Greek versus Roman space, and it was essentially articulated by Vitruvius in the 1st century. His 10 books were, for me, the first conscious project of architecture, where he characterized and codified Greek space, the orders, adherence, what I would call rigid adherence to matters of proportion, certainly elaborating a syntax of what would be constituted as Greek space, and certainly the first mention of genius loci, i.e. the siting of buildings. There was not an idea of zeitgeist at that time. The second project was the project of the Renaissance and humanism, and was characterized by Alberti, who also, in a sense, wrote 10 books of architecture. But these were a critique of Vitruvius, and they were, in a sense, saying that Vitruvius was understood when he said firmitas to mean solidity or construction, and what Alberti said, what he really meant was that it should look like it was solid and constructible and structural, so that the idea of representation came in, the idea of history. Alberti said that the most important thing for any discipline was its history. And he introduced the idea of part-to-whole relationships, that is the idea of consinitas, where he says a house is a small city, a city a large house. That was what I would call the second project of architecture. It was followed by, in the 16th century, the Cinquecento, by people like Palladio, studying antiquarian conditions and etc. And also the introduction of the idea of Roman space as opposed to Greek space. The third project I want to argue was the project in the 17th century of Claude Parrot, who wrote in his Ordonnance of Architecture a critique of Alberti and Vitruvius. And first time that it was argued that there was an alternative to the Greek ideals. That is, that the Greek ideal, as it was understood by then in the 17th century wasn't ideal at all, that the measurements that people had made were problematic, and that one need not obey the syntax of Greek. And what he introduced several things, a very radical discourse for the 17th century. One, that the Greek was an idea of imitation, that is, imitating the rules of classical proportion versus invention. And he said that the Renaissance was an idea of invention, whereas the Greek was today, in his time, an idea of imitation. Then he introduces in this the idea that we must be up to date, we must be aesthetically progressive in the spirit of our time. He elaborates a critique of stasis, that is a critique of rules that are forever conjugate beauty, and therefore introduces an idea of the zeitgeist, even though the actual term doesn't come about until the 18th century. This project of Perrault's leads to the fourth project, which is the project of Piranesi, where you get for the first time a joining of written texts and invention and images as an idea that sustains a project in the 18th century. And then you have people, the critique of Piranesi by people like Winckelmann and Leroy and Lodely, and there's this argument now again in the 18th century of Greek versus Roman space. So that argument comes back, but it's basically now in the 18th century an argument based on text and image. The fifth project for me, and of course I'm collapsing the history of 2,000 years into 6 projects, but they're subsets of these, is that theory and history become one in the early 19th century. They become, as it were, their own discipline, that Tafuri will talk about, that historians and theoreticians shouldn't be doing what he called operative criticism, but should understand their work as a work parallel to the work of the project of architecture, so that the project of history theory becomes important in the 19th century, along with Romanticism, which has its roots in Perrault. Now, if we get to the 6th project, which is that if you no longer want to be involved in the dialectic of Roman versus Greek, invention versus imitation, modernism versus classicism, genius loci versus zeitgeist, if one says that these dialectical projects are problematic today, there is, I believe, an alternative to believing in progress, believing in sight, believing in classical rules, believing in modern whatever. And that is the idea of the autonomy of architecture itself. And to me, that is a project which has become, after the problematics of dialectics, that the internal searching for what is architecture, as opposed to being defined externally, can be defined internally. I would argue that the project of autonomy can be described in the following way. That is, I'm saying I'm now going to specifically talk about a single project, as opposed to projects like sustainability, parametrics, computation, etc. I believe that the project of autonomy is where the architect and architecture defines the world as is given, whereas in a practice of architecture is where the world defines the architect and architecture. And I would argue that sustainability is a practice which defines architecture and the architect. In other words, it becomes an excuse for consumption. I would argue that if we go back in history, the difference between a practice and a project is that Borromini, to me, had a project, Bernini had a practice, Bernini being the most powerful architect in the world since Philip Johnson. Since Philip Johnson. And of course, Philip Johnson, while he thought he had a project, had a practice. I think Aldo Rossi had a project and Jim Sterling had a practice. So it's not a question of quality or importance. It's a question of the attitude toward the culture and the society. The final thing that I want to say about this didactic overview of the difference between the two is that I believe a school is a place where one should understand the differences, not which one is better, but the differences between having a project and having a practice. Many of my friends, as most of my friends, I believe, have practices and are defined by those practices. That is where the world defines what they, in fact, end up doing. With that, as an introduction, if you know, there's a lot to disagree with.
So the gentleman has served.
Yeah, I've served. Yeah. An easy serve.
Yeah, it's quite hard to hit a soft serve.
Yeah. It's like eating soft ice cream.
Yeah, I
on
mean,
a hot day.
as you know, I wouldn't buy into the
That's why I did it.
into the sort of grand narrative of one line with the 6 steps and all of that.
Well, I mean, there are any number
But
of
even
narratives.
even if we added 1 million, it's suddenly at the end there was this thesis, right, about project versus practice,
Yeah.
which when you first said it sounded like project was associated with autonomy, right? It sounded that way.
Yeah.
Like you said, the project of autonomy
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
and then very quickly the opposition was autonomy, was practice, project,
Right.
and then it turns out that actually we can wind back in
Right.
time
Right.
and find that. So in a way, my reaction is against the historical narrative and just grabbing hold of the opposition between project and practice, which, as you say it, the project defines the world,
Yeah,
world,
right.
and in the practice, the world defines,
Practice.
let's say, the practice or
Yeah.
the project. So,
Right.
so in that sense, then one of the big things we have to figure out then is what the hell is a world in order to
Yeah.
understand what this difference is. And of course, there are different senses of the word world. One sense would be,
Well, let's take the stock market going down as the world. For one. I mean, we don't have to define the world. It's the economy, it's the political world,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
cultural. I mean, it's all those things that are not architecture.
I think the stock market is a project. But we would have, but we would have, but
Not
we'd
the
have,
way it rolls.
right, but we'd have to argue through first. I mean, let's argue through
Yeah,
the opposition, which
Yeah.
I like.
yeah.
Right, I mean, I think a lot. But a world could be, in one sense of the world is, it's the world of, it's objects, stuff, matter, right? But another sense of the world, which is maybe more relevant, is the world is that which has no outside. It's the world. It's everything. It's my world, right? And
If it has no outside and inside, then there's no such thing as more relevant, because all of it is relevant.
right. So and that's why the word
you said.
autonomy would resonate. You see, because if the world is that which has no outside, it's the world.
Yeah,
Then to say a project defines the world, it means it defines everything, which means then that an architect who's doing a project is using something relatively small, like a commission or
Right.
a book or whatever, to create
an idea of,
everything, and
yeah.
that surely is like a major impulse of architects, right? And for sure.
For
right?
sure, it's not just architects, it's a major impulse of economists, of political people. I mean, they're all trying to define the world. in a
Right, but
certain-
staying with our union, or the union of the
Okay,
architects,
union architects.
that means a project. I mean, of course, the word project is to throw, to
Yeah,
project.
yeah.
So, in that understanding of the project,
Which is not projective, by the way.
right, right.
Just to make sure.
It means
we-
that to make a project, to have a project, to throw, it's not to throw, for example, a design into the world, but it's to throw a world.
World.
You throw a world.
That's right.
And therefore, to say it in a kind of clumsy way, if a world is that which has no outside, has no walls, no limits, the architect in this case is using limits, walls and things, to produce the sense or the effect or the dream or the reality of that which has no walls, an entire world, right?
I mean, it's let's say it's either a metaphor or a metonymy of an entire world. It's not the entire world. It is an idea, and like a painter paints. I mean, there are painters that have projects. There are painters that have practices. They try and define the world through a canvas, let's say. Clearly you can't. So the architect, just because he builds, is no different than a poet, a writer. I mean, you know, we were talking before with Reinhold, Wagner attempted to define the world in his project. He wasn't just writing operas. He was defining a Geist that he wanted to do through music, through the operatic form, to define a world.
Right, so that has him way down the project end.
Right.
Like one of the issues here is
Right.
project and practice as you define it, two kind of utterly different alternative realities, or is it a spectrum?
Spectrum.
And I think the moment
I would say-
you say, for example, that it's not to project the entire world,
Right.
you're kind of moving down the line towards
Well,
the
yeah,
practice.
but you have to be didactic when you're speaking for 10 minutes to define what project is. I mean, you know it when you see it, okay? I mean, let's put it that way. I would say, for example, Raphael Moneo, who's doing a building here, had a project, right? I would say Bernard Schumi had a project, right? I would say Oriol Boigas, as opposed to Moneo, had a practice. He didn't have a project, all right? Even though he was concerned with urbanity and larger scale projects than Moneo. Moneo had a project, a vision of the world as he saw it.
Right.
So I would think you could take any number of people who, doesn't mean the quality is better or worse, but there's a project.
Right, but I'm still back at a more kind of
Okay.
military position, which is like, okay, how to line up these divisions.
Yeah.
Because if staying with the more extreme understanding, if the architect with a project is throwing a world, and that is to say, architecture is the mechanism for generating a world, right? Defining a world, you say.
Or defying.
Right.
Or defying, militant.
Right.
Right.
So if that's the gesture, right, which is to sort of throw a world,
Right.
which I think is a bit, it's very easy to see that fitting into a lot of what we do and
Right.
think about and admire.
What our history is
It's
made
not
of,
clear,
by the way.
and it's a question for you, I guess, is if this is the case, just staying on the project side and forgetting about the practice side for a moment.
Practice side is easy.
Right. But do we live in a project?
No,
Right?
No.
What follows from that is that you don't live in a project.
we don't live in a poem either.
Right. So,
Yeats's poetry.
right. So you throw a world. A world is not an interior.
No,
Right? A world does not have an outside. So
No.
it doesn't have an outside.
Yes,
It doesn't have
no,
an inside
inside.
either. So you don't. Neither is a project thrown into the world. It
No.
is the throwing of a world.
World.
But you don't. It's not an. It's not an. It's not an invitation to live in the world.
No.
Right. Now, if you run to the other end, to the practice side, where the work of the
Can I go back? Can
Yeah,
I
yeah.
just before we go to the other side, one little footnote. My argument would be that despite everything, the history that we understand
right,
that constitutes our discipline that throws the world has always been a history of project, not of practice. In other words, there were many French architects doing little white houses in the 20s and 30s, but we remember Le Corbusier. There were a lot of others that built many more. They were probably just as nice to live in, just as economical or whatever, just as image-wise as good, but they didn't have a project. L'Orsat, Malestévance, etc., right? I've been to them, and there was something different. So I would argue then the same with Borromini and Bernini. Bernini was absolutely powerful, had all the commissions, etc. Borromini had very few, yet I would say that Borromini had a project and Bernini didn't. That doesn't mean one wasn't a good, it was just the way the world, they defined the world that they found.
right.
Okay, so I'm saying is that our history seems to resound with, resonate with architects as the history of poetry or the history of music or any discipline is in fact made up of people who had a project.
Okay.
So now we can go to
So on the practice side, a little bit the opposite of each of those conclusions, right? That not only is practice, as you've defined it, is somebody who not only allows the world to shape what they do, but that's the quality they most appreciate in what they do.
it is the quality.
Right. So that person sees themselves as working in the world, being worked on by the world,
Right.
and it is in, like it is so in the same way we said that you don't live in a project, you do live in practice.
Right.
And that's the sort of, so this is how the stereotype works. And it sounds right. And it sounds like it splits all those couples that you
More or less.
and you say you like both sides of the equation, but
Oh, I do. I like Sterling enormously.
it's like saying some of my best friends are practitioners, right?
They are.
Right. But deep,
They very much are.
right. But if all of that would
My dean.
careful. Well, if all of that was to disappear, you wouldn't grieve.
Or, no, you can't define project unless you have the other. They define one another.
Right, but if I said to you,
No, I would
if
hate
you
to
lose all of the projective side, you would grieve. Firstly, you'd be gone. You'd
Yeah.
be the very first
Project-
thing to be...
Don't say projective. You said
It was a
project-
slip.
Yeah, please don't do that.
If we take out the project
Right,
out,
right.
gone,
Bye.
you are the first to go, right?
Yeah.
Despite being the professor, Charles Guthrie professor in
Right.
practice.
That's a
right?
subterfuge.
Which is another variation. You would grieve. So in other words, you you know,
For my own demise, you betcha.
yeah. So you would say, playing for the project side as you do, you would say, yeah, we need the straight guy. We
Yeah,
need
absolutely.
practice in order to be as interesting as we are. But the practice side doesn't say we need
No, they don't.
the project side, right?
No, they
so,
don't.
so
That's a fallacy on the practice side.
right. So all sort of, as it were, need
Yeah.
is associated with the worldly side, with the
No
practice
question.
side. They're
Absolutely.
in the world of need. We are needed. Society needs us.
Yeah.
We provide what people need,
Right.
etc. And they don't need it.
They don't need it.
It's
you.
other. with
Right.
The project. So in this
Only
environment,
our discipline
right?
to sustain the discipline, and the society could care less. The world out there, to sustain our discipline, they would. I mean, I would never say to a client, "I'm doing this. It's going to cost you a little money to sustain our discipline."
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
like it doesn't go. That
Yeah, yeah.
doesn't sound good.
Okay, so far we can.
There's an imbalance. You're saying it's
Yeah.
not dialectical,
Not at all.
not at all. It's not a spectrum, by the way. There's a schnit somewhere.
Right. Now, getting back to the Schnitt. All of this is, like all of this I kind of want to say, yep, but it doesn't quite work.
Well, can I
in
just
this-
ask you, let's go back to Reinhold this morning saying he loves a certain team because of the way, the beauty of the game, right?
Yeah.
The guy who owns the team could care less about the beauty of the game. He wants to know, does he put people in does he make money, right? And so I would say the project of football is the beauty of the game, if you want to take it like that. But the beauty of the game doesn't matter to the guy who owns the team, to the world.
Yeah, but the team is owned by its fans. No, the team is owned. You know, the Arsenal that you're talking about defines and is an artwork. It's a piece of art. It's a kind of painting.
Arsenal is
No, it's a
defined
paint.
as,
It's really a painting.
as Reinhold said, Arsenal is defined by media. In other words, they nominate certain players to our stars. As Reinhold said, who wants to see X or Y? You know.
Yeah, but the media is just is a surrogate word for the fans.
Okay,
right?
so it's defined by them. All
But
right.
it's an art but basically it's an art project, and impossible to say who produced this artwork. Impossible to say whether it's a product of,
Fair.
you know.
But let's go back to let's
Yeah.
go back to the other.
No, but it fits very well. It actually fits very well because it could be argued that, and that's what and I think it's what also Reinhold was saying, Arsenal is a project.
Yes.
You see, it's a thought. It's the thought, and this is the brilliance of Barcelona, by the way, because Barcelona has done this trick, which is to treat the game as a project. That is to say, its sheer beauty is in theory more important than any outcome, but they're also the very best team, so they have all the
They're
outcome.
also almost broke,
This has entirely
by the way.
But Barcelona has traumatized the world of football.
Yeah, they have.
Because the idea of such beauty being also success.
No, they're
is
not success.
very
That's the thing.
Wow.
Because they're almost broke.
All right.
I mean,
To be continued. To be
no,
continued.
but let's say they are a project, all right? Let's say for
Yeah.
a minute that they're a project. You're now defining that that it is a project concerns an idea, whereas to practice you can have beauty in the work that you produce, but it may not constitute an idea. That is, in some way. Whereas, lots of teams can play well. They can beat Barca. I would say that Real Madrid, for example, does not have a project. Barca has a project, but they may play as well.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I mean, I'm willing to go out and say that.
So on Sunday, in the first round of the Supercuppa, we're going to see the collision between art in the form of Barca
Yeah.
and money in the form of real,
Well,
and you'll see what and you'll see what happens. But
And what do you think is going to happen?
no. Let's. Yes, what you just said is true. It seems to me that idea that the project team, since we're into teams, the project team is the ideas team. But there are two uninteresting reasons that that's true. The first is we get to decide which words go. You see, the project team is also the words team. Right? We get to make the classifications. The world team says.
By the way, we are in a university setting. We're not in the Parliament or in the Congress.
I noticed.
We're not in the Tea Party meeting. We are in a different kind of words meeting.
Right. So we're going to get back to the school, but the project team is also the words team, because the practice team says actually the world talks and we listen. So the practitioner says, I listen. What I'm really good at doing is listening. I listen to the world and I modulate what the world tells me.
He thinks he's good at listening. That's the fallacy also.
Yeah, well,
because you could say his project is a project of listening.
Well,
and he ain't very good at that.
The paradox is that the practitioner says that they only listen, but they say it.
That's not true.
So they speak the theory of listening, right? The project team says we have the word, so we say that the word idea is with us.
Yes.
So that's the first uninteresting reason that yes, the word idea. But the very idea of ideas is the idea of project, because the idea is that which could be in the world, that which precedes the world, that which could generate the world, that which could be lost in the world. So in the kind of Plato and on sense, the world of ideas is exactly the world beyond the world, right? So, of course, the project team is on the side of that which leaves the world behind, that which may come before, may come after, may come during, and so on. So, yes, we have the ideas, but in the end, that's just we're just reassuring ourselves that we have the best uniforms. It's not great.
Let's take this setting. I want to just bring us back to this particular setting. We have, you and I, being involved here, sitting here, a responsibility to point out the difference between the two. Not to tell these people you all should be practice people or you should be project people, but to say, here's X and here's Y. And either one of them is a viable, I believe, viable in the world. And I think it's the university, not the practice or the project. That is, it's not Rafa's responsibility or Bernard's responsibility or Venturi's responsibility to articulate that difference. It's our responsibility in our roles here to articulate what those differences are, to open up those possibilities, because not everybody can either practice or have a project. In other words, not possible. And to say that schools are only about project is a fallacy, just as to say that a school, what the ideal of a school, as the school that I'm, for example, involved in, has always been to create practice, okay? So I think the role of the school, whether it's Columbia, or let's say a non-state institution, that is a non-institution that has a responsibility to the discipline as opposed to the society, as this one does, right? As opposed to Kansas or Nebraska or whatever, has a responsibility to the society. That's why they're paying for their education. We, in this school and in other schools like it, have a responsibility to point out the disciplinary differences that are at stake in either one. That's why I raised the issue today. Not one is better than the other, one is right, one is wrong, but that there is disciplinary distinction.
Right, but I feel like that between you and I, anyway, we haven't quite got all the wrinkles of the project versus practice figured out.
We're never going to do that today.
So, no, but let's say we haven't even come close.
No.
That would then allow us to make kind of commentary on what might be good or bad for schools to do with this.
Well, I was
So
arguing.
I think we're one step short. And what
Okay.
I'm
Go
trying
ahead.
to say is that not only is it unevenly balanced in the sense of it's not symmetrical,
No,
as you've just implied, it's also a numbers game. That part of the logic of what you've just described, and I agree with, will mean by definition there will be very few people on the project side and many, many people on the practice side. And this is just an uninteresting consequence of the fact that, for example, if everybody was on the so-called project side, that would be normative practice.
that would be. But
Right.
the question is, the aspiration for project should be in everybody's, at least as an aspiration.
Okay. But just stay with this thought that
I understand that if everybody were in the project side, or vice versa.
right, before we judge, like good practice, bad practice, before we judge, what we're learning so far is, in this opposition between project and practice, the way you framed it, and like I could do it differently and people in the audience would do it differently again, but in the way you framed it, there will always be many people on the practice side. That's part of the argument, the sense of the normative, the sense of the world.
No, you're saying that. I'm arguing that in a production consumption society, the institutions have a responsibility of producing consumers, and practice architects are involved in production of consumption. So I don't know why the numbers have to be the way they are. In other words,
Well, I think it follows from the argument. See, it follows from.
Does it?
Yes, it follows from that at a professional level, that project will not only mean, let's say, the projecting of a new world, the throwing of a world for a hypothetical public or community or client or whatever. It will also mean throwing a new discipline, right? So it will mean that.
Well, a critique of old disciplines.
Right. So it's just a kind of uninteresting, a matter of definition that there will be on the so-called worldly side more. There will, and on the project side less.
Well, let's ask.
Like for example, there is.
But you're only limiting it to. I would argue, and I'm certain there are people here that are in academia, that there are architectural historians that have a project, and there are architectural historians that practice the history of their craft. They look for archaeological, antiquarian impulses, etc.
Right, and I would say by definition, and in a not very interesting way, there will be more of more of those than the others, because that's partly how the ones who have a project define themselves as having a project, as being in a minority.
But we're now going to say that at this institution, there
Not
are
yet.
more.
We're still going around the
No,
park.
we're going to get. I want to get to this because there are more art historians at this institution than have a project. That's why they're here. So we're talking about an institution that is a nurturer of project.
This is a minority central.
Well, yeah, but we're here. Here we are.
Right.
We're now talking to the world, throwing the world.
Right.
I'm saying is that the thing that sustains this institution is that it is a haven for project people. That is, they're accepted here. And they're not in the minority.
So one possibility is I'm just wrong.
No, I'm just saying is they're not.
In which case, we're not going to get much further. And another possibility is I just didn't say it right.
You wouldn't be here as dean if you didn't have a project.
Yeah, but you see, you keep jumping to the end game, and I think you can't
sorry.
get to the end because without disagreeing with a single detail of your argument, and now we've sort of fleshed it out. We've got a sense of what these definitions work and so on.
Yeah.
But one of the consequences of this model is that almost every dimension of it is flipped, because even if a minority in every group and in every classification will be placed according to your rules on the project side and will be more involved in the generation of worlds than in the reacting to and absorbing worlds, nevertheless, even
No
in
question.
such a
There has to
ratio,
be.
were I to leave this room, or even this conversation we're having now, or anything that I will do, it will be very, very difficult for me to locate anything that I might encounter that is not or could not have happened without a project. In other words, the original opposition between the world as
Right.
being there, relentless, with momentum, having its own opinions, forces, realities which could be listened to, versus the thinker, the creator, the philosopher, the thrower, who wants to change that.
The world is
It's a far too
actually-
comfortable opposition, because the world itself, which
is
is
the
what
summation
is-
of all
it-
past projects.
is nothing but accumulated
Projects.
projects,
It's
which
a
is what I
combina-
mean by, and you know, the stock market is almost a too easy example
Yeah.
of a project in which more than any other architecture school you will find, experts are sitting there going, what the hell is actually happening here? And they say, well, what I think is happening is it's the world
reacting.
of projects, and hypothetically they believe themselves to be referring to a
Okay.
kind of worldly condition that may be even more worldly than the earthquakes,
Okay. Now let's
sun,
accept that.
and so on, right?
Let's say that the world that we're talking about, that we're throwing this project
Right.
into, is the summation of all past projects. That's what the world
Right.
could be defined as.
Well, there are
No,
many worlds.
many worlds. Okay. What I'm saying is that in order for those which have survived, there have been a multitude
Right.
of the people not in the world who have not survived. In other words, whose voice has not been heard.
Right, right.
Okay? So I'm saying is that the world always is the summation of those people who have survived.
Not sure. I mean, almost. Going back to the project team, the project team relies too easily on the thought that the world is what it is, and can then be countered, resisted, overcome, transcended, and so on by the project. The practice team almost cynically acts as if the world has no agenda, has no
Right.
theory, has no ideology, has no position, and such that their own work is then rendered innocent.
Which we know it isn't.
So, for example, in your opposition between Rossi and Stirling, Stirling, and one could name so many other architects, is able to position their work as some kind of craft with available forces, cultural, technical, and so on, negotiating and acting as a kind of silicon linking and a sort of microclimate of situations versus Rossi, who everywhere through time and through history, one could imagine if he was commissioned in ancient Greece, one knows what
Right.
he would have done. Each relies on a kind of false image, it seems to me, and
Well,
so this is finally how I think one could get back to the school, because the opposition between the project and the practice so often is simply how does one, in any work that you're doing, set up the definitions of the context or the nature of your practice. The moment I start, I make some definitions of world. And in that moment, I've already
Even false.
Right, I've already launched
Right.
a kind of a project. And I've launched it in doing exactly the opposite of what seems like a project. I'm saying, well, first, I have a table, I have water, and I have a microphone. I pretend to just point to the world, but the way I point, how I select, what I see, what I don't see, already absolutely redefines and creates the possibility of another world. So many, many times, and this is a consequence of what both of us have been saying so far, not only can we make this division between those who really want to define themselves in terms of project, in terms of the throwing of a world versus the accommodation to the existing world, you can have within each camp real stupidity In other words, it would be a huge mistake to, as it were, side with the project team and say all is good there,
Right.
because you can be infinitely stupid on that side and infinitely stupid on the other side. And that seems to me a lesson in an architecture school, that in the end the opposition is not simply between, it's not a matter of choosing project versus practice. Project very, very easily becomes practice. To give an obvious example, the evolution of theory in architectural discipline since the 70s or whatever, a history you played a huge role in. You could argue that that was a project, for sure.
Yeah.
Not only was it a project, it was a project to support the whole idea of project.
Right.
Right? How to set up a mechanism by which there'd be a sort of intellectual infrastructure for generating and supporting this kind of action. We could argue that it relatively quickly became a normative form of practice. Okay. That is to say, there's a lot of people who would self-identify as theorists,
Yep.
who could not have done so without what you guys did, and you in particular did in the 70s, and yet nothing about the work they do really constitutes the throwing of a world.
So let's talk about the marketplace, okay? Because that's where and the marketplace for students, right? If we did a ballot of our students at Yale, let's say, and I have to only speak for them, they say, who do you want for your critic? They're not so much concerned, by the way, and this is one of the reasons for raising this today. Right. They're not so much concerned that an architect either have a practice or a project. They're concerned whether that architect has media, that is hot. All right, their favorite architect would be Bjarke Ingels, okay, because he's hot. Now I don't think Bjarke Ingels has a project, okay, but my students all think that he is whatever it is that they want to be, and they don't make this distinction between project and practice. That's who they want to be teaching them, okay, even if he can't teach, right? That's what they want. So I'm saying is that what has become cloudy in the marketplace of students, and it may not be in Nebraska the same, but the kids up at Yale are pretty sophisticated and they can tell the difference. They would rather have Bjarke Ingels than, for example, David Chipperfield, right, who's coming. They would rather have Bjarke Ingels than Leon Krier, who's coming, or Dimitri Porphyrios. Okay, I see you.
I think we better get back to the safe territory of Barcelona versus Real.
No, I'm saying is that if you took a media poll of who they want, they don't make the distinction between project and practice. By the way, it's become confused to them because project is not clear today. In other words, that was the last, in other words,
well, I don't think the primary purpose of an architecture school.
One of its purposes is to find that difference, I would argue.
I don't think the primary purpose of an architecture school is to produce or support the production of, or even the work of the students. By which I mean,
I understand.
Before it's misunderstood.
No.
The real obligation of a school like this one
is to produce knowledge.
Yeah, is the development of the discourse. The assumption here is,
or the discipline,
the students will redefine the field shortly after they've been here, but in ways that could never have been predicted or even supported while they were here. So rather, what happens is that when the students are here, they collaborate with the faculty to generate new knowledge and new potentials. Yeah. And the students use that experimentation, not even using that knowledge to generate here, to come up with their own thoughts about how they will act in the world. This is
it's not just Columbia.
You're going to have to give me a minute.
You're giving your Columbia Dean speech, and it's not just...
always. But it's an important distinction between a school that would see itself, as you said yourself, professional.
Yeah.
Right? In other words, if you have a school, imagine that you wanted to have a school that had a project. using your rules?
I think that would be really difficult. I mean, there are schools with a project. Miami has a project, Notre Dame has a project.
No, that's a practice.
No, it's a project.
No, that's a practice. That's
No,
a
no.
practice. That's
No.
totally academic I mean, I think the word academic would be associated with what you call practice.
Yeah, but I would argue that
it's rule-
to have it a school of tendency.
It's a school.
Let's
with
talk
rules.
about a school of tendency, which is what
Yeah.
Miami and Notre Dame.
No, they have rules.
Yeah,
They have rules.
they
It's,
have
it's
rules.
you know,
Yeah, you can do things one way.
right. So I think you can have a school that whose main interest, let's say, might be what you call project, but in this moment of time, such a school could only accomplish that mission by engaging fully with what you define as
As practice.
practice, because
No, you said last
the
year, as a matter of fact. No?
world is weirder than almost any
Yeah, but
architecture
you
school.
said last year that education was a bump in the real world, that it shouldn't engage itself with practice, that it was a place to slow down, moving toward a practice. That was last year.
No.
Yeah, you did.
No.
It was a speed bump. You
No.
used those.
I could make some
have
money
a qu-
here. How much?
No,
how much
you
money
couldn't. No.
No, the traditional, I can repeat it, the traditional mechanism of a university is to pull yourself out in order to reconnect, right? But the pulling out of the circumstances in order to reflect and reconnect in past, and not in the very distant past, meant opening up a huge gap between, let's say, the profession and
You're
experimentation.
saying the speed bump was in the past.
I think it's a very different moment now. It's a moment in which the biggest experiment in human history is being carried out, which is the formation of the city of the future, a city that will, in some way, try to absorb 75% of the world's population. We know less about that city than we do about Mars, and we're moving towards that city of the future faster than we're moving towards Mars, but it's like this. And in that moment, there's a kind of flip of identity where a school devoted to research and experimentation goes deep into worlds normally understood to be very distant from them, right? There's a sort of a flip. The reverse is also true, that professional officers have to go deep into reflective experimental research in ways that they never had to do before. So this is just a weird moment of
We
our
need
present.
we're at time, but I wanted to disagree. We haven't disagreed about much yet. I believe that the role of the school is to create in a student's consciousness a capacity to understand that when he or she leaves school, because of what they've learned, they know nothing. And that the beginning of learning, the capacity to begin to learn, is in fact after school, that you learn nothing in school, but the capacity to know that you know, and that to me is an education. When you can finally say, I don't know anything, because it's very difficult to say that, you have really learned a lot.
Oh, I totally agree. I think, and as you know, I think a school is or a good school is a stupidity reduction machine.
Right.
And
we should-
its primary purpose is to increase the odds. All you can do is increase the odds that the students that you collaborate with while they're here, just have slightly better odds of developing new forms of knowledge after they leave. And that new forms of knowledge will be by definition in some world defined as practical, as practice.
No question.
But it can flip in a microsecond into project.
But it would seem from our discussion, if I were in the audience, that we're trying to blur the distinction with the two, but I think the distinction helps you ultimately to make that definition of new forms of knowledge. It's one of the distinctions, the reason why I put it on the table is really useful, because there are people whose goals in learning are to get a successful practice, not a successful project. And I would say that the general norm would be toward becoming a successful practitioner. I mean, the model would be X, Y, and Z. And we all know who those people are.
Right. But maybe a final wrinkle, and we should join in with the audience. But I think,
Yeah.
and maybe this is just not a very interesting way to say it, but if you take the accumulated, we can divide up all of our colleagues into one team or the other, but if you take the architectural discipline as a whole, somehow the net effect of that discipline is paradoxically more on what you call the project side than on the practice side, even if, by definition, by the rules of the game, more members of its community must be on the so-called practice side. Because in the end, the position of the architect relative to what used to be called society does remain marginal and is perhaps only valued to the extent that it has the characteristics of project. And this is an important twist. Even those people you named that are on the so-called practice side, even they receive the commissions they receive because their clients see them to be on the project side, see them to take something straightforward, ordinary, direct, functional, technical, logistic, infrastructural, and give it intelligence, beauty, art, dignity, rhythm, and all these things. So this is the other paradox, that within our field we can make these divisions between project and practice, but in a wider scheme of things, I think the architectural field is profoundly on the side of project. And you have almost made the point yourself, because the people that you have identified as the kind of key figures on the project side, these are the people who have probably done most to define the kind of intellectual infrastructure of our field. Vitruvius, Alberti, Claude Perrault, etc. So basically, in as much as the discipline is a discipline, it is project, according to you.
Let's
even if most of us.
Then I have to have another footnote. I would argue that you don't have to teach practice. You have to teach banking. You may have to teach economics, but banking is another issue. In other words, many people don't believe you need to go to business school, learn economics, and then go into banking. I don't think you have to have a school that teaches practice. So therefore, I would argue that practice doesn't need to be taught. You'll learn how to practice. I believe I would be the best professional practice teacher in a school, precisely because it's not something that you need to learn by book knowledge. You'll need to learn by experience. Secondly, I wouldn't have anybody teaching in my school that didn't have a project, because they shouldn't be teaching. They should be out practicing. School is a haven for the people who have a project. And I would imagine that 90% of your faculty and most faculties in private institutions have a project of some sort. That's why they're here.
Yeah, it's hard for me not to do one last backhand because of course what
it's
you say.
Your nature.
Yeah. What you say is so true, because by definition practice cannot be taught, because by definition, according to your rules, practice is that which allows itself to be defined by the world. It is not the teacher. It is. So of course, university is about teaching. This comes as a great shock to the audience.
Should we have questions? Unless Reinhold, you want to. There's one back there.
Okay.
Is there a microphone? There's one.
Hi, yes. I was wondering if, let's say, since you guys use Barca and sports, just to tie it to, let's say, companies, do you think a company like Google is a project or a practice? Like, do you think that they're they're a company that sets out to just, they basically envision a world, but they also go about a way in which they do it. You know, they actually make the world faster. I don't know, that's something that I was thinking about.
Well, for me, the answer is of course, yes, it's a project, but of course, I ultimately think it's all a project, that the world is always ever only a world of dreams, of projects, layered upon layer upon layer. And so the world is a kind of archaeology of endless projects. Google it's a great question because, of course, in some sort of information sense, Google, starts to become a kind of surrogate for the world, because the Google is what you can see, what you can search, right? So in the end, we've lost any distinction between how to see and how you see and what you see. So Google is a world project, no question, I think.
I don't think that defining Google, whether practice or project, helps us to define the idea of the difference between an architect in practice and an architect in project as I've defined it, that is, as the definition of the world. Google doesn't define the world. In fact, it is the world defining us. It is part of the world defining us. So I would say Google is largely a practice. An enormously, like Wikipedia, is a practice, right? In other words, my students don't use first sources anymore, they use Wikipedia. So you're not going to ever develop a project from using Wikipedia. I think it's even a better, more insidious example. The first thing you get when you look up Google and you look up like Lodely, like I would look up Lodely to find a reference to his famous treatise, I get Wikipedia, okay? Now there's an insidious situation where it's set up to give you Wikipedia as opposed to a primary source, right? So Google is insidious in that it covers up primary sources, what I would call project sources, to provide you with practical, time-saving sources. So in that case, for me, Google is precisely the Bernini of information technology.
So that's one yes, one no.
One yes, one no.
Emma,
Good question.
you want to try?
Go ahead.
I have many mixed feelings. First, I think that architects make reality the dreams of the society. Second, I am not very sure about what you are proposing, Peter. Are projects Neoplatonics and practice Aristotelian? Are we talking? Are we talking about projects Neoplatonics and practice Aristotelian? Are we talking about the role of the intellectuals and artists in the avant-garde, in the old Marxist terms, that the projects one have to go over and the practice are the other ones? Everyone here has to have tomorrow a label, every student thinking, I am project, I am practice, and they are a label on the head thinking they are project, they are practice. You are saying Bernini is practice, so projects are the one who has a theory and has a project, the architects who are thinking and writing, because I really don't care about usually what the architects think. I care about what they do and what the architecture they do. I understand if you say Rossi is a project and Aimonino is a practice in the Galaratese, and let's take a project. Okay. I am not so sure about Rossi and Stirling, because one of the most poetic things I have seen were made by Stirling. Leicester was beautiful, yes. beautiful. I am not talking about the last Stirling. Is Alvar Aalto project or practice for you? Because Alvar Aalto never knew how to communicate these things. He just made architecture a wonderful one. So it's good for a school to teach practice only. That has been the failure of Barcelona school. They were projects when I was a student in Madrid, in Barcelona, was wonderful because it was projects. Now they are only practice, failure, absolutely failure. But a school has to teach practice. Can creativity be taught?
Yeah.
And is linked a project to creativity, or is linked a project to some intellectual thing and intellectual construction of the world? I think when Mark was trying to blur a little bit these things are more blurred because it's more mixed. It's more mixed, and afterwards people will redefine themselves in the real life out of this space of thinking and of reflection. But if we try to redefine one or the other, we are putting in a stress that I don't think that is real.
If you take Venturi and Scott Brown's theory of the main street, which is almost all right according to them, you don't have to go to school to learn about the main street. It will happen despite what you know. Whatever the main street is at any moment in time will always be. But the idea of the main street as a project is something that you could teach. You don't have to teach how to do the main street. You have to teach what the project of the main street is. And so there is I would never use Imanino to Rossi because Imanino is a lesser architect, let's say, a wonderful human being, a lesser architect. Stirling was not a lesser, in fact, he's a better architect than Rossi. Why I use that thing is that there was a consciousness in Rossi, like a consciousness. Stirling's a better architect than Venturi. Venturi had a project, a very clear project. Doesn't mean he was a great architect, but he had a project. And I'm saying is that we don't have to teach how to be a practicing architect because the world will define what that is for you. If you don't like that, already you have a practice. In other words, if you don't like the fact that I think the world defines practice, then you become a project architect. And it's the question of how you deal with the reality of what is imposed on you. I think that the idea of refusal, the idea of, would you take X commission or Y commission, is decisions that everybody has to make. Will you do certain things to be successful? And I think that those things are define the difference. There are differences, but you cannot teach practice, I don't believe. You can teach a theory of practice, but not which is project. So I'm not sure I agree with you. I don't know what the dean
Yep.
or you.
That a project is loosely associated with a person at some point, but then it expands into the world, and the person may have a link. Borromini may have a link to the project, but may not be attached to the project forever. While practice, it's very much attached to a person. Therefore, media can associate a person and a practice, and a person can become hot. Like, I was just thinking, when I was a student, MBRDB was the hottest thing. And I cannot remember the name of I've been trying to say, what is the name of the person, the lead person of MBRDB? It's only been 15 years.
Vinnie Mas.
Vinnie Mas, thank
But
you.
they didn't have a project, and that's why you can't remember.
Exactly. So it was, he was associated with a project, the project of the small, medium, large project that didn't
That's
belong to him.
Koolhaas's
I know. I know, but so he was associated with a project that took on, and we all know about it, and we all celebrate it, and he and media kind of like, but he became the practice of that project.
Yes.
So maybe,
I would agree. I mean, MDRV or whatever it's called, Motor Vehicle Department, was an outshoot of, it's a typical example, was the person with the project, the Epigones didn't either need one or couldn't have one, right? And you can find that. I mean, I'm very fond of an architect called Carlo Reinaldi, who you could say followed after Borromini and Palladio, etc. But Reinaldi didn't have a project. He had great buildings, but not a project. So I think what I was trying to say is that what media has blurred today, where students think that MVRDV had a project, is we need in a school to be very clear what defines project as opposed to practice, and which has been, in a sense, blurred by media today, where we think X architect had a project and they never did and never would. That doesn't mean they're not of certain value.
I think that the discussion between project and practice might have been too complicated to say more simply that perhaps what we have is a distinction between a pragmatic versus a philosophical approach to architecture, or to even any other type of disciplines, where pragmatic architects are the ones that tend to practice, and projectists or philosophical architects tend to projects. And evidently we have a spectrum that goes from practice to projects and vice versa. We have different combinations in different people, and different people can swing back and forth among the poles of that spectrum. And what we have in history then is eras in which, when we mostly have doers versus shakers, that's one other way of distinguishing between practitioners and projectists. If we mostly have doers, we may have an stagnant, boring time in the discipline, whereas if we have a lot of shakers, we might reach a time of revolution. And if we have a good equilibrium between doers and shakers, we may have a good opportunity for reforms that might bring us closer and closer to the world that we envision as a better world. But in any case, one other thing that was missing from the discussion, I think, is the unpacking of the concept of project, because it seemed as if project was always something to look for, that it was good, that we should embrace, that schools should have people that always advocate for projects. But projects can come in many shapes. There are projects and there are projects. We need to know more about the nature of projects, because there are projects that are proactive versus reactive. There are, most importantly, projects that are progressive rather than regressive. Sustainable development is a progressive project, and I would argue that religious fanaticism would be a regressive project. So what type of projects are we conceiving of and nurturing in ourselves, our societies, and our schools? And another comment would be, perhaps all projects, in order to be projects, needs to be embedded with a certain ethics. That it is not sufficient for a project to have aesthetics, that is modernism versus postmodernism, or Greek versus Roman, that you have to have a sense of a good or a better versus a worse world that you conceive through that project.
Well, there's nothing I can disagree with what you said. I can't disagree, but I think Mark struck a chord for me when he said that the project of today, if there is one in architecture, is that we don't have a way of understanding urbanity, the city, that 75% of the world are going to be living in the next 100 years. And we haven't made any advances, as far as I'm concerned, in what that project would be. We could go through the history of architecture. There have been model projects, Ledoux, Le Corbusier, Filarete, I mean, on and infinitum. We know the form of those ideal models, let's say, utopias, Fourier, etc. Where is that thinking today in the schools and in architecture? I don't see it. In other words, if you look at the new towns that are being built and proposed in China, aren't they variations of what we've known for the last 100 years? Is there anybody thinking the city as a project? And what would that mean? And there are a lot of people practicing in the city, but not thinking the city. And so I think Mark's point that we know more about Mars than we do about the future project of the city, I would agree with that. I would think it's really frustrating to me that, first of all, if you said to me, Peter, would you like to teach that course? I'd say, I can't, because I don't have an idea about that, okay? I can't teach that, and I don't know many people who could teach that course or open that up to speculation. I don't know any architects who are either practicing or projecting today. I know it ain't Main Street is almost all right, and I know it ain't learning from Las Vegas, because that can't do it. And so I think Mark has hit me with a stone wall that I recognize, and that is there is a distinction, and that's why when he says that, I say, aha, Mark, you've just confirmed the distinction I made, because there are a lot of people practicing about the city, but not many of them have a project of the city. And the reason is that it is a difficult project. And I think to suggest that there are visions out there, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, just
Yeah.
piggybacking on that, you make a lot of very important
Yeah.
points. Two quick points in response. I mean, one is it's not clear to me that the world needs worldly architects. I think the world would just do fine without
Yeah.
worldly architects.
Nobody said they did.
No, I mean, just as a
Yeah.
sort of general rule, but the worldly architects do. Does the world need this other if we can just for a moment stay with this stereotype, the architect of the project, which is not by accident the architect of the book, because when your examples, Vitruvius, Alberti, Palladio, Perot, Piranesi, Rossi, these are the writers. So these are not just people who use words, they are the inventors of the words of our field. So there has been a lot of slippage in our conversation between the architects on the side of the project and the architects on the side of theory. And the opposition, instead of the classical theory practice, has become project practice, right? So my general response would be, the world doesn't need worldly architects, or to put it more precisely, it doesn't need that part of the worldly architect, which is exactly what the worldly architect says it is, worldly. It needs actually this other part of the worldly architect, which is hidden, which is more romantic, transgressive, more resistant, more friction, more like a form of friction. And I don't believe, as a corollary of that, I don't believe the world would commission worldly architects, because by definition a world doesn't need worldly architects, because the world is the world. If the architect is worldly, you don't need that. What the world might need is whatever it is in the worldly architect that's not worldly.
But they wouldn't commission that.
Which is a lot, for example, in the case of Stirling, which is a lot. even
And
if
they
he
didn't commission him.
even if he doesn't write the books. But if you look in photograph after photograph after photograph of Stirling at who was standing beside him in so many different situations, they are the writers of the books.
Right.
Not just the books about Stirling, but he was a great carnivore of ideas. The second point is more about this.
Well, take Smithson.
Yeah.
Now, Smithson
Yeah.
couldn't get a job for this hoot. He had a project. And Stirling and Smithson stand like this and were like this. Stirling was, I think, a better architect. Smithson had a project.
Ellison or Peter?
I'm sorry, I don't know. It's almost time to go. I don't really.
All right. All right.
We could
But
say.
the Smithsons is a great example because as super young architects, they got a huge success, practical success at the beginning,
Yeah.
which traumatized forever this relationship between. I mean, I think it'd be a great example to talk about. The ethics one, though, is more complicated because in a sort of strict sense, the person with the project cannot have ethics to the extent that the person with a project who's in the exaggerated sense we're talking about, who throws a world, cannot place that world under judgment without imagining an outside to that world. Right. So it is simply invent the world. So to have an ethical position involves you being able to evaluate the consequences of different projects. And in the exaggerated sense we're talking about, that can't happen. Which is why, as you point out, the greatest violence comes from this project,
Right.
projective.
Nope.
Sorry.
There you go again. I don't think you mean that.
So the greatest violence can come from this. Ethics itself could be thought of as in project terms, and that's something else to think about. Next question.
We gotta go.
Oh, we do? Okay.
Well, I mean, I thought you.
Last
you
one.
know, you're
Last one.
Yes.
viral.
Okay,
Yeah.
so then in this framework in which you're working or outside of it, what becomes of that thing that's been called a critical practice? So is
The
there a
critical
way?
practice is a project.
Well, that's, but then,
The minute it's not just.
but
a
isn't that where the
practice.
blur happens? And so
Well, that-
suddenly
You could say that. I mean, a project is not necessarily not a practice. It's a different form of practice. It is a practice. I mean, I would say that the Smithsons had a critical project, and Stirling had a practice, but it wasn't necessarily a critical practice. I think critical, I said, was the operative term, that all of these 6 projects that I listed were all critical of those things that had gone before.
But then you have something like a situationist movement that is engaging in a kind of practice that starts to blur the boundaries between the kind of practice.
Well, if
you're
you
referring
say
to.
the situationists are practicing architects, then I would say
Oh, no, I'm just saying
we're
practice.
way out of
And
focus.
What's the
You
what
would
kind of
never
practice?
define them as practicing architects or practicing, that was a project. The fact that you said the situationists, were a project. So,
Well, to say some of what we've been saying again, in disciplinary terms, the figure of the architect has been, and has been pinned again and again and again through routine after routine, institution after institution, has been pinned to the thought that an object can create an aspiration beyond itself, such that a building could take you out of the world, or a doorknob, or it doesn't matter. That thought that an object can be used as a sort of medium for departure to a new world, as a form of aspiration, is kind of built into every aspect of our field, and is never more obviously than in a school of architecture, to the extent that Peter's opposition between practice and project refers to the throwing of a world or beyond the world. Almost by definition, the field as a discipline is attached to the project side of your opposition. Almost and equally classically so, the idea of an architectural profession, which is one of the youngest, newest aspects of your story, attaches itself to that thing that you will call practice, and it defines itself as a discipline in nervousness at the success of engineers in winning the confidence of royalty in constructing images of political authority and so on. So there is built up in the moment of the birth of architecture schools like this one, this kind of opposition between practice and project, which in this school was embodied in the figures of McKim, the disciple of Richard Morris Hunt, who did so much not only to build this building in which you're sitting now, but in so much of American professional practice at that time. And on the side of the project was William Ware, another disciple of Richard Morris Hunt, who argued for research and for the production of history and the production of books. So in this school there's always been this unbelievable tension between a school formed around the model of what you call project, in a kind of seething cauldron in 1881 of a nation trying to understand where the hell things were going. And in that moment of time, the United States was 29% urbanized, having been 15% urbanized 40 years before, and by 1920 it would be 50% urbanized. So right in the middle of rapid urbanization, this school was placed and then struggled with the relationship between practice and project as you defined it, and has always been profoundly on the side of project. In this particular moment of history, when the entire planet is 50% urbanized and it's 6 times bigger than it was in 1881, that opposition doesn't help. In philosophical terms, I think the opposition always somehow collapses once it's examined, always blurs, always, as Clara was saying, always multiplies and overlaps and confuses. Nevertheless, the discipline is still structured around it, which is why I think it has been super important to hear, as it were, Peter's angle on this all too classical opposition, and how schools should or not react to this. My only thought is, hopefully in a kind of biodiversity of ways. In other words, every school will run an experiment with this transformation. But I play on the project team, obviously, and so I'm bound to say that those who play on the practice team only pretend or only veil their absolute desire to throw a world. Right. And they just veil it a little bit. But equally it's true that those on the project team disguise to the extent to which they are consummate professionals, consummate practitioners, which is why I don't think it's such a paradox that Eisenman, who's the very flag-waving, cheerleading member of the project team, is the professor in practice somewhere else. Anyway, it was nice to hear Peter again, and very kind of you to come and put up with us. See you again next year.
Thank you. It's how you define architecture.
Just to put an exclamation point on this, I hope that this has been a useful introduction to things going on in this room and beyond. Speaking of cities, as London burns, nevertheless the question may still be, is Fabregas going to Barcelona or not? But you can be assured that the people doing the burning are asking that question themselves. If you're deciding which tattoo to get on your forehead, I would suggest a P. For obvious reasons, and do come back for the various events going on. Gavin Browning back in the back is in charge of Master of Ceremonies during the rest of the year. You'll be hearing more from him and from the Buell Center as we enter the actual academic year. Enjoy your summer. Thanks for coming.